He told her she didn't belong there. I remember the way the words came out of his mouth, sharp, cold, and completely devoid of shame. I was at the reception desk in our small office when she walked in. Her name was Angela, and she had this confident, graceful way about her. She wore a neat blouse, slacks, and carried a folder that I assumed was her resume. Her smile was warm but nervous. She greeted me kindly, asking where she could find Mr. Harris. I pointed her toward his office and wished her luck. But 5 minutes later, she came back out, her eyes glassy and lips pressed tight, like she was holding back tears. She didn't say anything to me, just hurried toward the exit. I didn't know what had happened, but then Mr. Harris stormed out of his office, muttering something about standards and knowing better. He glanced at me and said, "People like her shouldn't waste my time." It hit me like a punch to the gut. I didn't need a translation for people like her. He meant black people. He didn't even try to hide it. I didn't know Angela, but I knew she didn't deserve that. Nobody does. Months passed, and I thought about that moment often. I told my boyfriend, my sister, and a few close friends about it. Some of them said, "What can you do? People like him never change." But it didn't sit right with me. Then, one day, I saw Angela again. It was a Friday afternoon, and I was stuck late at work because Mr. Harris was too lazy to send his own emails. I was packing up when he came rushing out of his office, pale and panicked. He clutched his chest and gasped for air. At first, I froze. Then I grabbed my phone to call 911. But before I could even dial, someone else was already beside him. It was Angela. She was wearing scrubs, which I hadn't expected, but there she was, calmly taking control. She asked him questions about his symptoms, his history, what he'd eaten that day. She helped him sit down and guided his breathing until the ambulance arrived. She saved him. Later, I found out she was a nurse. She had been walking out of the pharmacy next door when she saw him struggling. After the paramedics took him away, I worked up the nerve to approach her. "Thank you for helping him," I said, "especially after what he did to you." Her expression didn't change much. She just said, "I couldn't stand there and watch someone suffer, no matter who they are." That stayed with me. Her words, her grace, her courage. When Mr. Harris came back to the office weeks later, he was quieter, less sure of himself. He didn't say anything about Angela, but I couldn't stop thinking about how small he must have felt. The woman he'd dismissed, dehumanized, ended up being the one who stepped up when he needed it most. I didn't keep working there much longer after that. I couldn't. But Angela? She made me see something important. That you can choose to be better, no matter how others treat you. I hope Mr. Harris saw that too. I'd like to say that Mr. Harris became a changed man after that day. That he realized how wrong he'd been, apologized, and tried to make amends. But the truth, I don't know if he ever really did. After his recovery, he went back to his old ways, cold, dismissive, and stuck in his outdated mindset. He never mentioned Angela again, at least not to me. I think part of him was too ashamed to acknowledge what had happened, and maybe part of him didn't want to. But the thing is, Angela wasn't helping him for recognition or a pat on the back. She did it because it was the right thing to do, and that stuck with me more than anything Mr. Harris could have said or done afterward. One night, months after I'd quit, I ran into Angela at a community fundraiser. She was standing at a booth, organizing medical supplies for a free clinic drive. I almost walked past, thinking she wouldn't remember me, but I couldn't resist thanking her again. "Of course I remember you," she said with that same warm smile. "You were at the desk that day." I told her how much what she did had impacted me, how her kindness and strength had made me rethink how I approached people, even in small ways. She laughed softly and shook her head. It wasn't anything special, just doing my job. But it was more than that. It was who she was. As for Mr. Harris, I heard through the grapevine that his business eventually shut down. A lot of employees left after I did, and the word got out about how he treated people. He didn't adapt, and in the end, his unwillingness to change cost him everything. But Angela? She kept rising. She didn't let one moment of cruelty define her or hold her back. She reminded me that we don't get to control how others treat us, but we do get to decide how we respond. Watching her live with that kind of dignity made me want to be better, to not just for myself, but for others. Her story became a quiet inspiration for me, a reminder that kindness isn't weakness, It's strength. And sometimes, it's the strongest people who show it in the moments when they have every reason not to. Angela's impact didn't stop with just me. Over time, I noticed her ripple effect on the community. She wasn't someone who sought out the spotlight, but her actions spoke louder than any big speech ever could. One day, I attended a local panel about workplace diversity and equity, mostly out of curiosity. To my surprise, Angela was one of the speakers. She was hesitant at first, her voice soft and measured as she shared her experiences, but as she talked, the room grew quiet, hanging on to every word. She didn't call out specific people or incidents, but when she spoke about being dismissed or underestimated, I knew she was thinking of people like Mr. Harris. She didn't focus on the anger or pain, though. Instead, she talked about solutions show workplaces could do better, how people could unlearn harmful biases, and how important it was to lead with both accountability and compassion. Afterward, a line of people waited to speak with her, asking questions and thanking her for sharing. I overheard one young woman tell Angela that she'd been inspired to stand up for herself at work after hearing her speak at a previous event. It didn't surprise me. Angela had a way of making you feel seen, no matter what you were going through. A few years later, I heard that Angela had started her own nonprofit. It was called Pathways to Care, and it focused on providing medical resources and mentorship to underserved communities. I wasn't shocked, she'd always been a force for good, but I couldn't help but feel a swell of pride knowing how far she'd come. I visited her office once, just to see the work she was doing. The space was small but full of life volunteers buzzing around, people waiting to receive care, and Angela in the middle of it all, calmly juggling about 10 different things at once. "Look at you," I said, laughing as I hugged her. "You're building an empire over here." She laughed and shrugged. "It's not about me. It's about making sure people get what they need." That was Angela in a nutshell: humble, focused, and always thinking about others. One day, years after the incident with Mr. Harris, I got an email from him. It was short and to the point, just a few sentences. He wrote that he'd heard about Pathways to Care and realized it was run by the nurse who helped me that day. He admitted he'd been wrong to judge her and thanked me for reminding him of that moment. I didn't reply right away. I sat with the email for a long time, wondering if he'd really changed or if this was just guilt talking. But in the end, it didn't matter. Angela had already moved on, and so had I. Still, I forwarded the email to her. She deserved to see it, even if it wouldn't change anything for her. Her response was simple: "Thanks for sharing. I hope he learns from it." That was Angela graceful, even when she didn't have to be. I think about her often, especially when I find myself in tough situations. Whenever I feel tempted to give in to anger or bitterness, I ask myself, what would Angela do? She taught me that strength isn't about proving someone wrong or getting even. It's about holding on to your values, even when the world tests you. And every time I hear about the lives she's touched or the barriers she's broken, I feel grateful to have witnessed even a small part of her journey. She didn't just survive injustices, she thrived despite it. Angela didn't just change her own story. She changed mine, and I have no doubt she'll keep changing many more. Angela's story continued to amaze me, but I thought the chapter with Mr. Harris was long closed. I couldn't have been more wrong. It was about 2 years after the gala when I got another surprise. I was running errands downtown when I ran into Mr. Harris. He looked different, tired, older, and maybe even humbled. "Hey," he said awkwardly, recognizing me. I didn't really know what to say to him. It wasn't like we had left on bad terms, but the weight of what I knew about him lingered. "How are you?" I asked politely. He hesitated, then blurted out, "I've been trying to get in touch with Angela." That caught me off guard. "Angela? Why?" He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "My company's not what it used to be. After everything, well, I had to change how I do things. We're focusing on community outreach now, healthcare programs, partnerships with nonprofits." And he paused, looking genuinely uncomfortable. "I heard about the work she's doing with Pathways. It's exactly the kind of leadership we need." I stared at him, trying to process what I was hearing. The same man who had dismissed Angela without a second thought was now seeking her out not just as a consultant, but as a leader. "You really think she'd want to work with you?" I asked, unable to hide my skepticism. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'd like the chance to tell her I was wrong. And to ask." When I told Angela about the encounter, she laughed a short, almost disbelieving sound. Him? He wants to work with me, she said, shaking her head. Yeah, I said. And I think he's serious. She was quiet for a moment, her expression unreadable. I'll meet with him, she finally said, if only to hear what he has to say. The meeting took place at a cafe near her office. I didn't go, but Angela told me about it afterward. She said Mr. Harris was nervous, almost apologetic. He admitted to her that his old ways of thinking had cost him good employees, opportunities, and most importantly, his integrity. He didn't make excuses or ask for pity. Instead, he asked for her expertise and offered her a role to lead his company's new community health initiatives. I never thought I'd see the day, I said when she told me. Are you going to take it? Angela smiled faintly. I told him I'd think about it. I want to make sure it's not just about him clearing his conscience. It took Angela weeks to decide. She met with Mr. Harris again, this time with a clear set of terms. She would join his company, but only if she had full control over the programs and initiatives she would lead. She refused to be a token hire or a figurehead. If he wanted her on board, it had to be on her terms. To my surprise, Mr. Harris agreed. Angela started working with him a few months later. At first, I wondered why she even bothered, but then I saw what she was doing. She wasn't just working for him, she was transforming his company from the inside out. She brought in a diverse team, revamped outdated policies, and implemented training programs that focused on equity and inclusion. She made sure the programs weren't just for show but actually served the community. As for Mr. Harris, he kept his distance from the day-to-day operations, letting Angela take the reins. I think he finally realized that real change meant stepping back and letting someone more capable lead the way. Years later, Angela moved on from the company to focus solely on pathways to care, but by then, her mark on Mr. Harris's organization was undeniable. It was no longer the rigid, narrow-minded place it had once been. It had become a force for good in the community, a direct reflection of Angela's influence. When I asked her how she felt about working with the man who had once dismissed her so cruelly, she shrugged and said, "Sometimes people change, and sometimes you have to be part of the reason they do." That was Angela, a woman who could see possibility even in the unlikeliest places. She didn't just help people like Mr. Harris grow, she inspired everyone around her to believe in something better, including me.